Coon Valley Ridge, Minnesota, October, 1884. The hills were on fire with the colors of a dying year, a final, defiant spectacle before the long, white silence of winter. On a windswept rise overlooking the valley, men paused their work, leaned on their tools, and stared at the thing Reinder Bouma was building. It wasn't the cabin that drew their eyes. A standard box of hewn pine logs, chinked tight with mud and moss. It was the roof, or rather the monstrous shadow it was becoming. The structure grew not upwards but outwards, a vast, low-angled hip roof that seemed determined to swallow the cabin whole. It looked less like a house and more like a mushroom, a great wooden cap perched on a timber stalk. Each day the absurdity grew. Halsey Pridemore, the county road overseer, and a man who understood the brutal arithmetic of snow load and wind shear, pulled his wagon to a stop. He was a practical man, his authority built on bridges that held and roads that stayed graded. He watched Bouma, a quiet Frisian immigrant, meticulously lashing long timbers to the cabin's top plate, extending them out into open air, 11 feet out. "Bouma!" Pridemore called out, his voice carrying the easy confidence of established expertise. He walked over, gesturing with his chin at the cantilevered beams. "What in God's name are you building? A shelter for the whole county's livestock?" Jebediah Stone and Silas Croft, neighbors who had stopped by to deliver a load of firewood, chuckled. "Looks like you're roofing the whole ridge, Reinder," Silas said, shaking his head. Reinder Bouma, a man of few words and deliberate movements, looked down from his perch. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Pridemore stepped closer, his tone shifting from curiosity to professional concern. "That skirt is going to load with drift, Reinder. I'm not guessing. Come February, when we get a heavy, wet snow followed by a freeze, that uneven weight will twist this whole box right off its sills. I've seen it happen with half that overhang. It'll shear the cabin clean." The other men nodded. This was the language they understood, the physics of failure. Bouma simply looked at the sky, then back at his work. "The wind will keep it clear," he said, his English thick with the accent of his homeland. He turned back and lifted another rafter into place. The men exchanged glances. The man was a fool, a madman. He was building his own destruction. They called it Bouma's Folly, the mushroom house. The mockery was quiet at first, then grew more open at the general store, a shared joke that bonded the community in their collective sensible wisdom. They were frontiersmen. They knew how to build a cabin that would stand. And this was not it. What did this Frisian reed-thatcher, a man from a flat, wet country of canals and sea winds, understand about the crushing, static weight of a Minnesota winter that these expert log builders had missed? This channel is dedicated to the lost wisdom of innovators who were mocked before they were revered. Their solutions to the deadly problems of frontier life were often counterintuitive, but they were rooted in a deep understanding of the laws of nature. To help us continue to unearth these stories of ingenuity, please take a moment to subscribe and click the bell icon. I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand the physics of convective heat loss in a way you never have before. What's the most unconventional but effective solution you've ever seen for a common problem? Let us know in the comments below. Reinder Bouma was not a carpenter. He was not a logger or a farmer. In the old country, on the storm-lashed coast of Friesland, his hands had never held a broadaxe or a peavey. They had held a thatching needle, a reed knife, and a bundling fork. He had spent 30 years of his life working with the hollow stems of Phragmites australis, the common reed, weaving thick, waterproof, and surprisingly warm roofs for the long, low farmhouses called borderai. He understood wind not as a force to be blocked, but as a fluid to be managed. He thought about the movement of air the way a boatwright thought about the movement of water. His first winter in Minnesota, 1883, had been a brutal education. It had nearly killed his family. He, his wife Ankie, and their 2 children, Lou and Femke, had huddled in a hastily built cabin, a structure praised by his neighbors for its tight-fitting logs and solid foundation. But it was a trap. The cold found its way in not as a draft, but as a presence, a heavy, sinking thing that lived in the corners and radiated from the walls. The stovepipe on the windward side of the house became a torment. During the worst gusts, it drew backward, puffing acrid smoke into the single room, forcing Ankie to open a window and lose what little precious warmth they had. The lard in its crock never softened. Pressing a finger into it was like pressing into cold clay. It held the print perfectly. Ankie would do the wash, and the shirts she hung near the stove would freeze flat indoors, stiff as boards, before they could dry. The children slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the air. That winter, Reinder didn't see a problem of insulation. He saw a problem of assault. The house wasn't just losing heat. The heat was being violently torn away. All around him, his neighbors fought the same battle with the same weapons. The conventional wisdom of the Minnesota frontier was to build thick and burn hot. A cabin was a fortress. The walls were the armor. The stove was the artillery. A family's wealth could be measured in the size of its woodpile. It was a war of brute force. A well-built cabin had logs a foot thick, carefully dovetailed corners, and chinking so tight a knife blade couldn't find purchase. Yet, they all suffered. The problem wasn't the construction. The problem was the physics everyone was ignoring. They were fighting conduction, the slow seep of heat through solid material, and they were right to. A thick log wall, with an R value of about 1.25 per inch, was a decent insulator. A 12-inch wall had an R value of 15, not so different from a modern insulated wall, but conduction was only part of the enemy's army. The real killer, the one that drained their wood piles and chilled their bones, was convection. Specifically, forced convection. The thin layer of air right next to the outer wall of a cabin would be warmed by the heat slowly conducting through the logs. This layer of warmed air, the boundary layer, acted as an additional, invisible layer of insulation. In still air, it was remarkably effective. But the air on a Coon Valley ridge was never still. The winter wind, howling down from the plains of Canada, was a relentless thief. As it screamed across the face of a log wall, it performed an act of violent thermal stripping. It scoured away that warm boundary layer instantly, replacing it with brutally cold, dense air. The temperature differential between the inside of the log and the outside of the log became immense, and the rate of heat loss, the rate of conduction, skyrocketed to compensate. A 30-mile-per-hour wind on a 0-degree day could strip heat from a surface as effectively as a -30-degree day with no wind. The settlers knew this in their bones. They called it wind chill, but they had not applied the principle to their houses. They saw the wind as a force that drove cold into the chinking. They failed to see it as a force that stole warmth from the very surface of the logs themselves. They were trying to insulate against -10 when their walls were actually fighting a war against -40, and they were losing, one cord of wood at a time. Reinder Bouma watched his neighbors stoke their fires until their stovepipes glowed cherry red, burning through a winter supply of wood by January, and understood. He wasn't going to build a better wall. He was going to build a better sky. The construction of the great roof became the settlement's autumn entertainment. Bouma framed the massive hip roof first, a complex structure of angles and joints that baffled the onlookers used to simple gable roofs. The central part rested on the cabin's top plates as expected, but then came the extensions. He bolted heavy timber outriggers 11 feet long to the main rafters and the top logs, extending them horizontally into space on all four sides of the cabin. They looked like the wings of some clumsy, grounded bird. "He's building a dock for a flying ship," Jebediah Stone quipped at the general store. Halsey Pridemore made another visit, this time with a level and a plumb bob, as if to prove to himself the structure was as insane as it looked. "Bouma, the snow that will pile up on this thing will weigh tons, not pounds, tons, and it will be all on the outside of your foundation. It will lever your walls outward." He demonstrated with his hands, showing how the outer weight would lift the inner part of the roof and pull the log walls apart at the corners. It was sound logic. "The roof will be steep enough," Reinder replied, gesturing to the 45-degree pitch, "and the mat will be slippery." This caused another round of confusion. The mat? Once the framing was complete, Bouma didn't start laying shingles or shakes. Instead, he brought in a wagon loaded with something no one had ever seen used on a Minnesota roof: reeds. He had spent the late summer harvesting bushels of common reed from the Mississippi backwaters, letting them dry in the sun. Now he began to thatch. It was a craft, a form of weaving on an architectural scale. He laid the reeds in thick bundles, 18 inches deep, starting from the massive low-hanging eaves and working his way up. He compressed them with a small wooden mallet and stitched them to the roof battens with tarred twine, using a long, curved steel needle. The resulting surface was a thick, smooth, golden coat. It looked alien, ancient. His wife, Anki, watched him from the cabin door, her arms crossed. "It looks like a brooding hen, Reinder," she said, a small smile on her face. "A very, very big hen hiding a very small egg." He smiled back. Hens stay warm. The final piece of the puzzle was what he did to the underside of the great eaves. He didn't leave them open. He built a soffit, enclosing the entire 11-foot overhang. Then he packed this enclosed space, this collar, around the entire upper portion of his house, loosely with more reeds. The mockery from his neighbors was relentless but not malicious. It was the concern of experienced men for a newcomer who was clearly making a fatal mistake. They were trying to save him from himself. Pridemore's objection was the most cogent and oft repeated. "That skirt loads snow uneven, shears the cabin off its sills by February." It became a catchphrase in the valley. Reinder never argued. He never defended his design. He just kept working, his movements economical and sure. He was not building for them. He was building for the memory of frozen shirts and his children's shivering bodies. He was building a zone of profound and permanent calm. The physics of Reinder Bouma's design were both simple and revolutionary. He had created a massive, passive barrier that fundamentally altered the environment in which his cabin existed. He had built a house inside another, larger, invisible house made of still air. Let's break down the three kinds of heat transfer. Conduction is heat moving through a solid, like warmth seeping through a log. Radiation is heat moving as electromagnetic waves, like the warmth you feel from a fire across a room. Convection is heat moving via a fluid, in this case, air. Bouma's neighbors were obsessed with stopping conduction. They built thick walls. Reinder understood that stopping convection was the master stroke. The 11-foot oversailing eaves were the primary weapon. Wind, no matter its direction, could not strike the walls of his cabin directly. The gale would hit the steep, slick thatch of the roof and be deflected up and over. The air directly underneath the eaves, from the edge of the roof to the log walls, was protected. It became a vast, trapped pocket of air, a dead air collar, 11 feet deep and wrapping all four sides of the house. This accomplished two things. First, it eliminated the wind stripping effect, the convective scour that Pridemore and the others didn't even know was their main enemy. The boundary layer of warm air on the cabin's outer walls was now allowed to form and remain undisturbed. This single fact dramatically reduced the rate of heat loss through the logs. The cabin walls were now interacting with still, trapped air that was only marginally colder than the cabin itself, not with a 30-mile-per-hour stream of Arctic fury. Second, the 18-inch thick mat of thatched reed on the roof and packed into the soffit provided a massive amount of insulation, far more than any wooden shingle roof. 1.5 feet of hollow-stemmed reeds, with their thousands of tiny trapped air pockets, has an R value of nearly R40, comparable to modern attic insulation. Heat rising from the cabin would be trapped by the thatch, warming the dead air space under the eaves even further. The snow that fell on the roof, which Pridemore saw as a threat, Bouma saw as an ally. A thick blanket of snow would only add to the roof's insulation, its R value increasing by about 1 per inch. The steep pitch would shed any truly heavy, wet accumulation, preventing the kind of structural failure Pridemore feared. Essentially, Reinder Bouma had built a structure that didn't fight the winter. It sidestepped it. He didn't build a stronger shield to take the blows. He built a system where the blows could never land. The battle wasn't at the wall anymore. For the Bouma cabin, the wall was a place the wind never reached. He had solved the problem not with brute force, but with elegant aerodynamic grace. That year, winter did not creep in. It fell from the sky like an executioner's axe. In the second week of January, an Alberta clipper scythed down from the northwest. It wasn't a blizzard, not a storm of heavy snow. It was a storm of pure cold and relentless wind. For 8 straight days, the temperature on the ridge never rose above 20 below zero, and for 3 of those days, it plunged to 31 below. The wind was the true monster, a constant, unyielding 35-mile-per-hour gale that screamed out of a terrifyingly clear blue sky. The valley hunkered down. Smoke plumed horizontally from chimneys, instantly torn apart by the wind. The sound was a physical presence, a low, grinding roar that vibrated in the teeth and bones. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a waking nightmare. The wind found every crack, every pinhole in the chinking, whistling through with the sound of a blade. The walls, scoured by the gale, were leaching heat so fast that the insides were coated in a thick layer of frost. Families lived in a small circle around their stoves, burning through wood at an alarming rate, yet the cold pressed in. At the Stones' cabin, the water bucket just 10 feet from the stove froze solid. Silas Croft's prize rooster froze to its perch inside the barn. Halsey Pridemore was out on horseback, his face wrapped in wool until only his eyes were visible. As road overseer, it was his duty to check on the outlying families, to make sure no one was in mortal danger. His journey was a battle. The wind tore at him, trying to pry him from the saddle. His horse, a sturdy Morgan, leaned into the gale, its breath freezing instantly on its muzzle. As he neared the Bouma place on the exposed ridge, the full ferocity of the clipper was unleashed. The wind came across the cleared fields with nothing to break it, a solid wall of moving cold. He expected to see the mushroom house in distress, perhaps with one of the foolish eaves torn away, the structure groaning under the assault. Instead, what he saw was calm. There was no plume of smoke being ripped from the chimney. A gentle, almost lazy curl of gray rose straight up for a few feet before being decapitated by the overhead gale. There were no frantic signs of a family fighting for its life. There was just the quiet, brooding shape of the house, seemingly indifferent to the elemental fury around it. He was 100 yards away when a particularly violent gust caught the brim of his heavy felt hat. It ripped the hat from his head, sending it tumbling end over end across the frozen crust of the snow. He swore, pulling his horse to a halt. The hat bounced and skittered, driven by the wind, directly toward Bouma's cabin. Pridemore watched, helpless, as it disappeared under the massive, low-slung eave. He dismounted, the cold hitting his bare head like a hammer. He staggered against the wind, his eyes watering, toward the house to retrieve his hat. He braced himself as he approached the drip line of the enormous roof, expecting the wind to be even more chaotic as it curled around the structure. He took one more step, ducking under the 11-foot overhang, and the world went silent. The roaring in his ears stopped so abruptly it felt like he'd gone deaf. The physical pressure of the wind on his body vanished. He stood there, bareheaded, in a pocket of absolute unnerving stillness. Above him, he could hear the timber of the great roof groaning as the gale raged across it, a sound like a ship in a storm. But around him, where he stood, the air was as calm as a summer evening. He could feel the blood starting to warm his frozen ears. His hat lay a few feet away, resting gently on the snow. He picked it up. His eyes fell upon the cabin's log wall. There was no frost on it. None. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the logs. They felt cool, but not the life-leeching cold of his own cabin's walls. Then he saw it. On the outer windowsill, a simple tin cup sat next to a small, dormant plant pot. Steam. A faint, almost invisible wisp of steam was rising from the cup. Stunned, he pulled off his glove. He picked up the cup. It was coffee. Lukewarm, but still liquid. Still drinkable. Coffee left outside in 31 below zero with a wind that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. His mind reeled, trying to process the impossible evidence of his senses. He looked from the steaming cup to his saddle. His own canteen, wrapped in leather and strapped to his horse just 20 feet away in the wind, was a solid plug of ice. He knew it without checking. He stood there for a long time, in the bubble of quiet Reinder Bouma had built. He looked at the calm wall, the placid cup, the still air. He heard the screaming wind just feet above his head, a monster held at bay by a simple, elegant idea. He finally understood. The mockery turned to ash in his mouth. He was not looking at Bouma's folly, he was looking at a work of profound genius. He walked to the door and knocked. Reinder opened it, and a wave of simple, comfortable warmth washed over Pridemore. Inside he saw Anki sewing by the window, not huddled by the stove. The children, Lou and Femke, were playing on the floor in their shirt sleeves. A small pot of chives sat on the windowsill, green and alive. Pridemore was a man humbled to his core. He didn't speak of the cold or the storm. He looked at the quiet Friesian. "Reinder," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "you didn't build a cabin, you built a calm." Halsey Pridemore did not just apologize, he became an evangelist. He rode back to the county seat not with a report on suffering families, but with a revolutionary idea. He unrolled his surveyor's maps and technical manuals on his desk. With a draftsman's precision, he began to sketch. Not roads or bridges, but a cross-section of the Bouma cabin. He called it the Bouma eave skirt, or the wind collar roof. He presented his findings to the county commission, not as folk wisdom, but as sound engineering. He explained the principle of convective scour, using the stark evidence of his own frozen canteen versus Bouma's liquid coffee. He argued that the county could save a fortune in firewood and improve living conditions at the remote section house camps maintained for road and rail crews. These camps were notoriously difficult to heat and keep supplied. There was skepticism, of course, but Pridemore's reputation was unassailable, and his conversion was so fervent that it commanded attention. The commission agreed to a trial, Before the January thaw, materials were dispatched to 6 of the most exposed section house camps. Under Pridemore's direct supervision, crews retrofitted the existing bunkhouses, building the great oversailing eaves and packing them with prairie hay and reeds. The results were immediate and dramatic. Reports came back from the crew foreman. Fuel consumption had dropped by more than 60%. Men were sleeping without shivering for the first time all winter. The Bouma eave skirt was officially added to the County Road Survey Manual as a recommended structure for high-wind, open-country environments. The idea began to spread, family by family, as settlers saw the proof with their own eyes. The mushroom house was no longer a joke. It was a destination. The frontier solution Reinder Bouma, devised in 1884, was a remarkable anticipation of modern building science. A century later, architects and engineers would develop concepts like the rain screen and the double-skin facade. These systems are designed to create a pressure-equalized air cavity outside the building's thermal envelope, protecting it from wind-driven rain and improving its thermal performance. Bouma, with his Friesian knowledge of wind and reeds, had created a rustic, low-tech version of the exact same principle. He understood that the most important wall of a house is often the invisible one you build a dozen feet away from the structure itself. There is a lesson in the quiet confidence of Reinder Bouma. The established experts, the practical men of the Minnesota frontier, saw the wind as an enemy to be fought with mass and strength. Their solution was to build thicker walls to make the fortress stronger. Their thinking was locked in a direct confrontation with the problem. Bouma, the outsider, the man whose expertise seemed irrelevant, saw it differently. He understood that the most powerful way to win a fight is to make sure it never happens. He didn't fight the wind at the wall. He made the wall a place the wind never reached. He solved the equation not by overpowering the variables, but by removing the most destructive one from the calculation entirely. True ingenuity isn't always about a better shield. Sometimes, it's about creating a silence where no shield is needed. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of quiet genius as compelling as we did, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing for more. Click the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of forgotten history. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What other modern technologies do you think might have rustic forgotten ancestors? Share your ideas in the comment section below. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. While the engineering principles discussed are based on real historical practices in physics, the specific characters, names, and events depicted are fictional creations for narrative effect. The application of any building technique, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.